This story is a work of fiction based on alleged true events. Some names, events, and locations have been changed to protect identities. The content may be disturbing to some readers. Reader discretion is advised. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. Thunder rolled like drums from the heavens, and the ground outside the Henderson plantation had turned to black slush. Lanterns flickered in the vast hallways of the mansion, casting long, stretched shadows that seemed to crawl up the walls. Somewhere deep within the house, in a candlelit bedroom lined with white linens and prayers muttered under breath, a woman screamed. Her name was Eleanor Henderson, young, delicate, and pale from a difficult pregnancy that the village midwives whispered about behind her back. She was only 7 months along, yet her stomach had swollen to impossible size, and her eyes had grown hollow from lack of sleep. For weeks, she had complained of hearing whispers in the walls and children laughing outside her window. But no one ever saw anything until tonight. Inside that room, Eleanor was giving birth. Not to one but to 2 sons, twins. Elias and Elijah Henderson came into the world in complete silence. No crying, no screams, just wide, unblinking eyes that stared directly at the midwife as though they'd already lived a lifetime. The storm outside ceased the moment Elijah, the younger of the 2 by seconds, was pulled from the womb. The silence in the room was unnatural, thick, suffocating. "Are they breathing?" one of the maids whispered, clutching her cross. "Yes, but why aren't they crying?" said the midwife, her voice trembling. She placed them gently on a towel. Elias opened his mouth, slowly, but what came out wasn't a cry. It was a sound like a sharp inhale, followed by a deep, guttural clicking that no one in that room could explain. The candles flickered violently. The youngest maid dropped the water basin and screamed, bolting from the room. "That ain't no baby sound," she muttered over and over as she ran down the hallway barefoot, slipping on the polished wooden floor. Eleanor, soaked in sweat and blood, lifted her head weakly. "Let me see them." The midwife hesitated. Something in her gut told her not to hand the babies over. But a mother's wish can be stronger than reason. She wrapped them in warm cloth and placed them in Eleanor's arms. As soon as they touched her, both infants turned their heads, at the same time, and looked straight into their mother's eyes, and smiled. It was not a smile of comfort, nor one of joy. It was knowing. 2 weeks passed. The twins were feeding well and showed no signs of sickness. In fact, the town physician, Dr. Morris Gray, was stunned at their rapid development. "They're extraordinary," he told Mr. Henderson, standing in the drawing room with shaking hands. "Their growth is beyond natural. Their eyes are fully focused. They follow my movements like trained hounds. I would like to observe them further, perhaps in Richmond." "Observe them?" scoffed Charles Henderson, a tall, cold plantation owner known for his rigid discipline. "You speak as if they are animals, Doctor." Dr. Gray swallowed. "Forgive me, sir. I meant no disrespect. But in all my years, I've never seen such advancement. They're not even a month old, but they sit upright for seconds at a time. Their grip strength is unnatural. And their gaze, God help me, when Elias looked at me, I felt as though he saw my thoughts." "You'll speak of this to no one," Charles snapped. "Not in town. Not to your colleagues. Do you understand?" Dr. Gray nodded slowly, but he had already written a letter to a colleague in Boston, one that would never reach its destination. That night, Dr. Gray's horse was found galloping alone on the edge of the forest, its saddle torn and stained with blood. His body was never found. Inside the nursery of the mansion, Eleanor sat motionless in her rocking chair. The twins were quiet in their crib, too quiet. The ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the room. Then Elias sat up. Not a jerk, not a fluke movement. A calm, fluid sit-up like a small adult waking from sleep. Elijah followed suit, mirroring his brother perfectly. Eleanor gasped. Both twins turned their heads toward her simultaneously and smiled again. And then they spoke. "Mother." A single word. A whisper. Too clear. Too precise. They were not even 4 weeks old. She screamed. The nurse came running, only to find Eleanor in the hallway, collapsed and sobbing. The twins lay still in their crib, eyes closed, breathing normally. The nurse tried to comfort her. "Madam, you're tired. It's the lack of rest." Eleanor looked up with wild eyes. "They spoke," she whispered. "My babies spoke." The nurse smiled nervously, nodding, but her hand gripped her crucifix tighter than ever. As the weeks passed, strange occurrences began to plague the house. Animals on the property refused to go near the nursery. The family dog, Rufus, once fiercely protective, now whined and clawed to escape whenever brought near the twins' room. One night, the butler swore he saw the twins walking. Yes, walking down the hallway hand in hand, while the rest of the house slept. But when he followed them, they had vanished. Their room was locked from the inside. When he unlocked the door and rushed in, the twins were in their crib, eyes closed. But there were muddy footprints, small, bare, identical, in the hallway behind him. Charles Henderson punished the butler for spreading mad tales, but he had seen the fear in his wife's eyes. He had heard the low, unintelligible murmurings coming from the twins' room late at night. Words spoken in tandem, words he did not recognize. One night, unable to sleep, he stood outside their door, listening. The whispering stopped. Then 2 small voices spoke in unison from inside. "Father!" The door creaked open slowly on its own. The Henderson twins were only 3 months old, but already the plantation was gripped by quiet terror. The staff avoided them. Eleanor stopped nursing and would no longer enter their room. And Charles? He drank more now, always armed. He kept a revolver on the nightstand, though he'd never needed one before. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one could explain it, because science had no words for children who should not walk, should not talk, should not know your thoughts or whisper your name while you sleep. And yet, the twins smiled, always smiling. By the time Elias and Elijah turned 6 months old, the world inside Henderson Plantation had begun to rot, from the inside out. The house still stood tall and stately among the Virginia pines, with its sweeping white pillars and wraparound veranda. To passers-by, it was the portrait of Southern prosperity. But inside those walls, beneath the flickering chandeliers and silent corridors, there was only fear. Silent, watching, breathing fear. The twins no longer cried, not even when hungry, not even when startled. They moved in near silence, always together, always in sync, like 2 reflections of one dark thought. Eleanor, their mother, now slept in the guest house. Her once lively voice had dulled into quiet muttering. She refused to speak of the boys, wouldn't utter their names. The nurses claimed they found her scrawling strange symbols into the margins of her Bible, symbols she insisted the twins had shown her in a dream. But not everything could be explained away by nightmares. Charles Henderson, a man of logic, finally reached his breaking point after a disturbing Sunday afternoon. The twins had been placed in the nursery with their governess, Miss Delilah Moore, a stern woman of God. She was one of the few remaining servants who hadn't quit or fled the plantation. That afternoon, she came to the drawing room trembling, her face the color of flour. Her voice cracked as she spoke. I caught them speaking Latin," she whispered. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Latin? You must be mistaken. They were speaking it clearly, fluently, like scholars. I've studied the Bible for 20 years. I know what I heard, and they were quoting scripture backwards." Charles stood up. "Enough of this nonsense." "I swear it, sir." They weren't even looking at each other. They were looking at me, eyes locked, and talking as if I weren't in the room. Charles had never struck a servant before, but something about the way she said it, as if I weren't in the room, made him furious and frightened in equal measure. He dismissed her that same night. She was found 2 days later at the edge of Black Hollow Creek, barefoot, soaked to the bone. Her hair had been torn out in clumps. She had clawed Latin verses into her arms with her own fingernails. When asked what happened, she repeated one sentence before lapsing into catatonia. "They are not 2, they are 1. And they are not from here." Charles had no choice. He summoned a physician. Not a village doctor, but a man of science from New York, a neurologist named Dr. Richard Alcott, who had spent years studying unusual child behavior. Dr. Alcott arrived in early October, carrying a large black case and skepticism. He interviewed the remaining house staff, read Eleanor's Bible full of the cryptic scribbles, and spent a full day observing the boys in their nursery. That night, he requested to speak to Charles alone. The fire crackled in the study. Outside, a bitter wind howled against the windows. They are beyond the realm of natural development, Dr. Alcott began, rubbing his hands together. Their motor control is advanced beyond comprehension. They speak in full sentences, ask philosophical questions, and they are aware, deeply aware, of the emotions of those around them. Charles narrowed his eyes. "What are you saying, doctor?" "I am saying," Alcott said carefully, "that they are dangerous." Charles scoffed. "Dangerous? They are children." "No," Alcott replied, voice tightening. "They are something that appears to be children, and I believe they are capable of psychic communication." "Telepathy," Alcott nodded slowly. "They do not speak when I am with them, but their heads turn together. Their expressions mirror each other. And, on 2 occasions, I heard my own thoughts spoken aloud." Charles went pale. "I believe they should be separated." Immediately, that night, Charles acted. He ordered 2 separate rooms be prepared. The left wing for Elias, the right wing for Elijah. Guards were posted outside each door. At precisely 2:03 a.m., the entire house awoke to a shriek. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. The walls seemed to tremble. Lamps exploded. Mirrors cracked. And down the center of the mansion, where the hallway divided the 2 wings, a long, blackened scorch mark was later found on the floor, like something had burned its way through the wood. When Charles and the guards burst into the rooms, they found both twins sitting upright in their separate beds, unharmed, but bleeding from the eyes. They were chanting, in a tongue that no one recognized. Dr. Alcott fled the house that night and never returned. He left all his equipment behind. Years later, a letter was found in his belongings, never mailed. It read, "They should never have been born. They are not of flesh. Their birth is a tear in the veil of reason, and we were foolish to think it could be studied." The next morning, Elias and Elijah were reunited in the same room. Their symptoms stopped. The bleeding ceased. They smiled again, but their smiles were wider. Too wide. Rumors had begun to spread in the town. A priest from Richmond arrived, claiming he had received a vision involving twin demons born under storm and silence. He begged to see the boys. Charles refused, but that priest would not be dissuaded. He crept onto the property one cold night with a rosary in one hand and a Bible in the other. He was found the next morning hanging from the iron gate, upside down, his own rosary twisted tightly around his neck. No blood, no struggle, just the words, "You cannot divide one," carved into the frost on the front window of the mansion. Eleanor stopped speaking entirely. She took to pacing the hallways barefoot, her gown dragging behind her, humming lullabies no one had taught her. She stared at empty corners and whispered to the twins when they weren't looking. Sometimes she would shush invisible voices in the dark. One evening, Charles found her kneeling in front of the nursery door, her hands folded in prayer, whispering, "They told me what I did in another life. They told me what's coming. I saw the future, and it doesn't belong to us anymore." He tried to pull her up. She looked at him with eyes hollowed by horror. "You made a mistake, Charles," she whispered. "They're not ours." Fall thickened over the town of Ellison, Virginia. The trees around the Henderson plantation turned blood red and died early. The river that bordered their land began to run slow and murky, as if poisoned by silence. No animals had been seen on the estate in weeks. Inside the mansion, the twins, Elias and Elijah, were now nearly a year old. But no one called them babies anymore, not even their parents. They walked fully upright. They spoke in full, complex sentences, and they never blinked unless someone was watching them. Eleanor no longer left her room. Charles drank heavily and stayed away from the nursery. No one was allowed near them except for the old housekeeper, May, who had gone deaf years ago and never seemed to fear the boys. But there was one final thing Charles insisted upon, for tradition, for decency, for God: baptism. He arranged the event quietly, through an old friend, Father Granger, who ran the local church. It was to be held on the final Sunday of October, a private ceremony before first light. The less people involved, the better. But as soon as the date was fixed, strange things began happening inside St. Bartholomew's Church. The crucifix above the altar began to turn upside down during the night. More than once, the font water turned black, thick, tar-like. The bishop's robes, stored safely in the sacristy, were discovered covered in handprints, small ones, child-sized, burnt into the fabric like they had been pressed with iron. The church cat was found dead, nailed to the bell tower door with its eyes gouged out. Father Granger called Charles in a rage. "You didn't tell me what they were." "They're children," Charles barked. "My sons. No child walks at 8 months. No child reads Latin scripture before their first year. Do you think I haven't heard what the town says? You owe me this, Granger." "I owe you nothing," the priest hissed. "And I will not baptize abominations." He slammed the phone down. Later that night, Father Granger was found wandering barefoot in the church garden. He was weeping. His skin was covered in bruises shaped like fingerprints, 2 sets of identical hands. He kept muttering, "They whispered to me. In my dreams. They said the water burns." From that moment on, no clergy in Virginia would come near the twins. And the church declared a quiet refusal. No baptism. Charles flew into a rage. He stormed into the nursery, furious and half-mad with drink. "You did this," he screamed at the twins. "You cursed your own blessing." They sat on the floor, playing with wooden blocks. Without looking up, they spoke together, one voice from 2 mouths. "We do not need blessing. We do not belong to your God." Charles slapped the table, sending their toys flying. "Enough! You will be baptized if I have to drag you into that church myself." The twins looked at him then, slowly turning their heads. "You can baptize water," said Elias. "But you cannot cleanse what comes from the dark," added Elijah. Then both smiled, and Charles felt the world tilt around him. He stumbled from the room. Later, he would not remember how he got into the wine cellar, or why he had locked himself in. Rumors spread further. No priest. No baptism. No salvation. Whispers in the village turned into open fear. Store owners refused to sell to Henderson staff. A note appeared on their gate one morning. "You brought the devil's eyes into this world." The plantation was now a place of silence, secrets, and dust. No guests, no prayer, no light. One final attempt was made. A traveling pastor from South Carolina, Father Merle, a man of fire and brimstone, had heard whispers of the children that God abandoned. He arrived at the Henderson estate unannounced one night, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a satchel of holy oil and relics. He demanded to see the children. Charles refused, but the man pushed past him, shouting scripture in every direction. "I do not fear Satan's seed," he yelled. "Let me look them in the eye and I will cast out what lurks inside." The house went still. The air grew cold. May, the housekeeper, stood silently at the top of the staircase, staring down at the man with tears in her eyes. "They already saw you," she whispered. He turned. The twins stood behind him at the base of the stairs, barefoot, faces blank. Father Merle screamed. The candles extinguished themselves. When light returned, he was on the floor, convulsing, foam at his lips. His satchel burned in the fireplace. He survived, but he never spoke again. The twins were no longer spoken of as children, not even by the staff who remained. "They're a presence," May whispered once to a maid. "Not born, just arrived." They stopped aging as children should. Their limbs grew longer, yes, but their eyes never changed. Still that same newborn stare. Still never blinking. Still always knowing. One day, Eleanor emerged from her room after months of isolation. She wore her nightgown, stained and torn, her hair tangled like a dying forest. She walked into the nursery alone, shut the door behind her. No one knows what she said, but the next morning she was gone. Her room was empty. Her portrait, once hanging in the parlor, was missing, and in its place, pinned to the wall, was a charcoal drawing of her, made crudely by a child's hand. Except in the drawing, she had no eyes, only black, empty sockets. When asked, Elias responded, "Mother went home." Elijah nodded. She didn't like it here anymore. After that, Charles was no longer the master of the house. He avoided the twins, avoided the nursery, avoided mirrors, because he had begun to see them in reflections, even when they weren't in the room. The baptism never happened. The church never came again. And the twins? They waited, smiling. Part 4. The Diary of Abigail Henderson, 1,000 words. If there was one person in the Henderson household who still dared to observe the twins without running, it was Abigail Henderson, the older sister. She was 13 when the twins were born. Smart, quiet, often overlooked in a house swallowed by storm clouds and stares. Unlike the others, Abigail didn't fear Elias and Elijah. At first, she had loved them as any sister would, curious, even protective. But when they began to walk before they could crawl, when they whispered in unison in the dead of night, she began to keep her distance. Not out of fear, out of instinct. It was in those silent weeks after their failed baptism that Abigail began writing in her leather-bound diary, a birthday gift from her mother. The entries started innocently enough, but by winter her words had become something else. October 2nd, 1852. Elijah stared at me again today. He knew what I was thinking. I was looking at his hands and wondering how he got a scratch. And before I said anything, he said, "It was the dog." I never asked the question out loud. October 9th, they sleep with their eyes open. I walked by the nursery, and Elias was watching the ceiling. I whispered "good night," just to myself, and he whispered back, "Sleep tight, sister." I hadn't made a sound. She began studying them like creatures in a cage. She took notes. She watched from the gaps in the wooden stair rails. She even left small puzzles and toys to test if they were truly learning or just remembering something older. They passed every test, sometimes before she even set it down. October 18th, they can move without sound. Not a footstep, not a breath. I was reading by the window and I looked up, and there they were, standing right in front of me, staring. They didn't blink. I didn't hear them come in. My heart nearly stopped. October 22nd, I saw them levitate a book today. That entry had been crossed out in thick black ink. But under candlelight, the writing still showed through. The deeper Abigail watched, the more patterns she began to notice. Most frighteningly, their language. The twins often spoke to each other when no one was around. Not English, not Latin, not any tongue Abigail had ever heard. She tried to write it down. Strange syllables, broken consonants, backwards whispers. The sound made her feel cold, like a door in her mind was opening to somewhere she had no business peeking into. October 29th, they speak a language I feel in my stomach. It sounds wrong, like a word that's trying to crawl inside your head instead of be heard. One night, unable to help herself, she pressed her ear to the nursery door and listened. For hours, the boys sat whispering. She couldn't understand the words, but the cadence made her ill. It was like a sermon spoken underwater. Then silence. Then Elias said, "She's listening." Abigail staggered back from the door in terror. A moment later, it opened on its own. The twins were in their beds, smiling. October 30th, they drew something on the wall in charcoal. It's a spiral, but the ends bend back into themselves like teeth. When I look at it too long, I hear something. Not with my ears. She began drawing what she saw in her diary. Symbols, marks, some resembling ancient glyphs, some unplaceable, all unsettling. But the most terrifying was not what she wrote. It was what was written when she didn't write at all. She began to wake up to new entries in her own handwriting, except she hadn't written them. October 31st, written at 3:16 a.m., unknown by Abigail. We remember what the sky looked like before stars were born. November 1st, Mother went willingly. Father will not. November 2nd, Abigail will watch us until we teach her to see. That morning, she screamed. Charles found her curled on the floor of her bedroom, clutching her diary like a shield. The ink on the pages was still wet, but she had no memory of writing any of it. She begged her father to burn the book. He refused. Instead, he locked it in a desk drawer and ordered her to stay away from the nursery. But that night, the drawer was found open. The diary was back under Abigail's pillow. And the spiral, the same one from the twins' wall, was drawn on the underside of her sheets. November 5th, I hear them in my dreams now. They show me things, places I don't know, skies without suns, black oceans, a city made of screaming towers. I wake up shaking. One morning, May the housekeeper found Abigail standing in front of the mirror. Just standing, staring. When asked what she was doing, Abigail replied calmly, "I'm trying to remember what my face looked like before I was born." She was 13. That evening, Charles demanded the diary be removed from the house and taken to the local pastor's library for safekeeping. But the man who transported it, Mr. Henry Tate, was found 3 days later on the edge of the swamp, mumbling nonsense, his clothes soaked, his fingernails torn off. He kept repeating one phrase, "The girl didn't write the book." And Abigail? She stopped speaking. She sat in the parlor each day, staring at the window, but not at the trees, at the reflection of the hallway behind her, where two small shadows always lingered, smiling, waiting. By early December of 1852, the people of Ellison began locking their doors before sunset. Black Hollow Forest, a dense woodland just beyond the Henderson plantation, had always been a place of whispers and old fears. Locals claimed the trees there could listen, that voices would echo even if you hadn't spoken aloud. But until the twins came, the forest had only taken animals. Now it took children. It began with 7-year-old Thomas Weller. He vanished one foggy morning while walking to the well behind his home. His boots were found beside the bucket. No sign of struggle. No footprints leading away. Just silence as if he had evaporated. 3 days later, twin girls from a nearby farm went missing during their nap. Their mother found their beds undisturbed, but the windows wide open, though the second floor had no ledge, no vines, no means of escape. Then, a group of older boys went rabbit hunting near Black Hollow. Only one returned. His name was Caleb Royce. He was covered in scratches, barefoot, his eyes wide and unfocused. He kept repeating, "They walked backwards into the trees. They held hands. I followed them. They smiled at me, and the trees opened." He never spoke again. Not a single child ever returned. The town erupted into panic. By Christmas, 11 children had disappeared. And in every home that lost someone, the same thing was found in the days following. A small drawing. 2 identical stick figures holding hands, always left on the floor, always drawn in black charcoal, sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the children's pillows. Back at the plantation, Elias and Elijah grew more withdrawn. They rarely spoke to Charles. They ignored Abigail entirely, and yet their presence felt stronger, heavier, like a scent in the air you couldn't wash off. One evening, as Charles walked past their room, he noticed something odd. The window was open. Snow had collected on the sill, and below it, in the garden, were bare footprints in the snow. 2 pairs, small, human. They led toward Black Hollow, but never returned. Charles followed them, a rifle in hand, a lantern in the other. The forest was silent. No wind, no birds, just the sound of snow melting against the frozen earth. The footprints stopped near a ring of twisted trees, blackened as if struck by lightning, but none of them had burned. At the center of the ring, something hung from the branches. A doll. Its face was stitched shut. Its arms were tied together with hair, and carved into its wooden chest were the initials, H. Abigail Henderson. He rushed home in horror, only to find Abigail asleep in her bed. But in her hands was another doll, identical to the one in the woods. She didn't know where it came from. The sheriff, desperate and terrified, finally organized a search party. 12 men with dogs and torches entered Black Hollow one January morning. Only 4 returned, and not a single dog. The 4 men spoke in broken fragments, rambling about hearing lullabies, about trees moving, about faces behind bark. One man, Isaac Melbourne, cut off his own tongue with a fire poker the next day. He never said why. Soon, the villagers turned against the Hendersons. Rumors boiled over into rage. On January 23rd, a mob arrived at the plantation gates. Charles met them with a rifle. "They're just children," he roared. "Blame me, not them." But the mob didn't come to reason. They came with fire. That night, the Henderson barn burned. Smoke clouded the winter sky for miles. But when they searched the ashes the next morning, they found no bodies, no bones, no signs that any animal had been there. Just a spiral carved into the dirt floor, burnt around the edges, still smoldering. And in the center, a child's tooth. White, unbroken, perfect. Inside the house, the twins remained untouched. Not a hair on their heads disturbed. And in their shared room, pinned to the wall, a map of Black Hollow, drawn in blood, with 11 red X's marked beneath the trees. When Charles demanded to know what it meant, Elias whispered, "We're only guiding them home." Elijah added, "They were already looking." Abigail returned to her diary. She hadn't written in weeks. But one entry, the last one before she stopped writing altogether, read, "They don't take the children, they call them, and the children choose to follow." By February, families began fleeing Ellison. The town population dropped by half in less than 2 months. But no one dared challenge the twins again. Not after what happened to Reverend Shep. He was the last man brave or foolish enough to march into the forest alone to bring the children back. 3 weeks later, he staggered out, covered in moss and thorns. He held a child's boot in his hand. He said only one sentence before collapsing dead at the town's fountain. "They are making a new church in the dark." No one went into Black Hollow again. No one mentioned the twins in public. And no one ever asked why the children were still being drawn to the woods. Because no matter how many times the sheriff posted guards, new footprints would appear at night, heading into the trees, always 2 at a time. Back at the plantation, the twins stopped speaking entirely. But they smiled more. And every night, before bed, they would trace the spiral symbol into the frost on their windowpane, watching as it melted slowly with the warmth of dawn. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a door, and it was open. The final day of February 1853 was the last time any visitor would willingly step foot inside Henderson House. It began like any other gray, bitter morning. The snow had grown soft from thaw. The chimneys puffed smoke into the bleak sky. Abigail was quiet, as always, staring out her window into the tree line. Charles had not left his study in 3 days. Eleanor's room remained untouched since her disappearance. And the twins? They waited, patient, smiling. At precisely 3:33 p.m., the housekeeper May screamed. It wasn't just the sound of fear. It was a breaking scream, the kind that told you something was deeply, impossibly wrong. Abigail was the first to find her. Standing frozen outside the nursery, hands to her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. The door to the twins' room had been blown off its hinges. Not broken, not bashed, blown open. The wooden frame was scorched, as if licked by lightning from within. Inside, the room was wrong. The walls, formerly pale blue, were blackened, peeling in long strips like dead bark. The crib was gone. In its place, a ring of ashes in the center of the room. On the floor were 2 small footprints, perfectly aligned, bare, charred around the edges. Abigail whispered, "Where are they?" May didn't answer, because something was moving inside the ash circle. Something that looked like smoke, but moved with purpose. It formed shapes, images, faces screaming silently, and then dispersed when Abigail stepped forward. And there, on the back wall, was scrawled the phrase, "They opened the door." Charles came crashing up the stairs, rifle in hand. "What happened?" Abigail pointed toward the nursery. But when Charles stepped into the room, the lights went out. All of them, not just in the nursery, in the entire house. The sun was still in the sky, but Henderson House fell into total darkness. Not dimness, not shadow, dark, like something had swallowed the light from within. May dropped to her knees, sobbing. "It's the veil," she cried. "It's open." The house began to groan. The walls pulsed, as if the beams inside were breathing. Paint cracked, glass shattered in empty rooms, and a low hum, like 1,000 voices praying backward, filled the halls. Abigail grabbed Charles's hand. "We need to leave," but it was already too late. From the first floor came the sound of screaming. The butler, Mr. Hanley. Then silence. Then something began crawling up the walls. Not feet, not hands, just motion. Shadows that pulsed and darted like insects beneath the wallpaper. Abigail whispered, "They're not alone anymore." They ran through twisting corridors that felt unfamiliar. Rooms seemed longer, ceilings higher. Doors led to the wrong places. Stairs spiraled in impossible directions. It was as if the house had become a maze. Or worse, was no longer entirely in this world. In the dining room, they found Eleanor's portrait, burning, but the fire made no sound, no smoke, and in its ashes, once it crumbled, 2 small handprints appeared on the wall, one above the other, as if climbing higher. Charles finally reached the study. He had stashed journals, ammunition, a pistol, just in case. But when he opened the door, the twins were inside, waiting, sitting on his desk, smiling. The spiral was drawn in ink across the floor beneath them, and above them, scrawled in childlike print, "We never left." Charles raised the rifle. "You're not my sons." Elias tilted his head. "We never said we were." Elijah added, "You named us." The house shook. A crack split the ceiling above the study, revealing not wood or insulation but sky. Not earth sky. Something black. Something moving. Alive with colorless storms. Charles screamed and fired. The bullet stopped mid-air, just froze, spinning in place. Then it reversed direction and struck Charles in the chest. He fell backward, gasping, bleeding, dying, and the twins never blinked. Abigail, hidden behind the doorframe, watched it all. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only whispered, "It's happening now, isn't it?" The twins turned to her, and for the first time, their smiles faded. Elias spoke softly. "You always watched." Elijah added, "Now you see." Then both in unison, "It's your turn." She turned and ran. Down the hallway, through the twisted stairwell that now seemed to pulse like a vein. Every painting was bleeding. Every clock was spinning. And from the nursery came the sound of a heartbeat, but not one of flesh, of wood, of walls. The house itself was alive. By the time Abigail reached the front door, it was gone. Only wallpaper, no handle, no frame, just a solid wall where the exit used to be. Behind her, the twins' voices rang out. "You live here now," she screamed. When the townspeople arrived the next morning, Henderson House stood still. No sign of damage, no smoke, just quiet, too quiet. Inside, they found the bodies of Charles Henderson and the butler, both cold and drained of all color. The housekeeper May was found in the nursery, alive but unresponsive, rocking back and forth with a singed Bible in her lap, whispering. They opened the door. The twins were gone. Abigail was gone. No footprints, no bodies, no clues. Only one thing remained, carved into the front door from the inside. "We remember the world before light." From that day forward, the Henderson estate was condemned. Locals claimed they saw figures in the upper windows at night, twin silhouettes standing side by side. Sometimes, visitors would swear they heard a girl screaming from deep inside the walls. Others heard nothing at all, just a low hum, like the house was breathing. Spring 1857, 4 years after the Henderson incident. A man in a black suit stepped off the last train in Ellison, Virginia. He wore dark spectacles, carried a leather briefcase, and spoke to no one. He wasn't alone. Two others followed behind him, equally expressionless, equally silent. They were not from the church. They were not journalists. They were sent by a department that, officially, did not exist. The only document they carried was marked with a single word, Henderson. The town sheriff had received word from Washington 3 days earlier. Do not interfere. Do not ask questions. Provide access to all property and files. That same night, the sheriff packed his belongings and left Ellison for good. No one ever saw him again. The men in black headed straight for the Henderson estate. They didn't flinch at the stories, didn't ask about the rumors, didn't care about the warnings scratched into the trunks of nearby trees. They simply walked into the front door, still carved from the inside with the words, "We remember the world before light," and vanished inside. The estate was sealed that day with iron locks and posted guards. For months, the townspeople only saw lights flickering from the windows. Some nights, strange siren-like noises rang through the hills. Other nights, nothing but silence. And one morning, everything stopped. The estate was now hidden behind thick walls of barbed wire and signs that read, "No entry, federal property. Trespassers will disappear." The house had been repurposed, or more accurately, converted. They called it the Silent Lab. Inside, a subterranean structure had been carved beneath the mansion. Metal walls, low ceilings, and long corridors lined with recording devices, chalkboards, and thick observation windows. In the center, a single containment chamber, 2 chairs, 2 beds, one symbol etched in steel across the floor, the spiral. And inside that chamber, unchanged, uniged, were Elias and Elijah Henderson. They hadn't grown. They hadn't aged. They hadn't moved. At least not visibly. They sat together at the center of the room, whispering to one another. Always whispering. Always smiling. Their hair was still clean. Their skin pale. Their eyes wide open. Unblinking. Every attempt to photograph them failed. Film burned. Lenses cracked. Early attempts at sketching them by hand led 3 artists to psychotic breaks. One jumped from a window claiming, "I drew something looking back at me." The scientists came in teams. Linguists, theologians, physicists, each one left more disturbed than the last. Because the twins knew things. They recited information no child could have access to, coordinates of planets yet to be discovered, burial customs of forgotten tribes, symbols not yet created. They could read minds, finish sentences, speak in voices that weren't theirs. Sometimes they would speak backward, and the audio, when reversed, would reveal warnings. One recording, still locked in a vault today, reads, "The gate has opened. The breath of what waits will reach you soon." One scientist, Dr. Howard Beckett, lasted longer than most. He conducted interviews for 43 days. Then he went silent, refused to leave the lab. He began drawing spirals on every surface, his hands, his walls, his food trays. He carved one into his own cheek with a fork. Before they removed him from the premises, he left a final note scratched into the floor beneath his bunk. "They are not twins. They are halves." There was a growing belief among the observing officials. Elias and Elijah were not 2 people. They were one will divided, a consciousness split for some unknown reason, a thing wearing the skin of 2 children. One agent called them an intelligence from beyond geometry. Another referred to them as the echo of a voice spoken before time. But no one could explain how they arrived, or why. Then came the whisper incident. A routine interview, conducted by Dr. Lorraine Kinsey, took a strange turn when the twins fell silent mid-session. Their smiles vanished. They turned slowly toward the 2-way mirror, and spoke one word in unison. "Listen." The recording equipment exploded. Every member of the observation team began screaming, covering their ears, blood pouring from their canals. Some clawed at their heads. Others convulsed. 3 died of brain hemorrhages within minutes. There was no sound in the chamber. No explosion heard on tape. But every person in proximity had heard something, later described as 1,000 voices whispering my name from behind my skull. After that day, the project was shut down. The Silent Lab was sealed. The twins were placed into cryonic suspension, at least that was the official term used. But those who cleaned the chamber after found no frost, no signs of cold. Just one final message scratched onto the inside of the glass with a fingernail. We are not sleeping. We are waiting. By 1860, the entire facility was buried. Steel doors, cement walls, dozens of feet of earth. Henderson House was flattened, erased from all maps. Locals were told it had burned in a lightning strike. A lie. The government moved on to new secrets, new mysteries. But in a locked room beneath the ground, under soil and silence, two small chairs still sit. Empty, some say. Occupied, others swear. And that spiral? It glows. Just slightly. Just enough. As if something beneath the ground is breathing. Still. October 1925. Richmond, Virginia. The man who walked into the records office was frail, pale, and wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too big for his body. His eyes were sunken, skin translucent. The clerk assumed he was homeless, until the man laid a thick, sealed envelope on the desk and spoke with a voice like creaking floorboards. I was there, he rasped. At Henderson House, at the silent lab. The clerk stared at him, confused. I'm sorry, sir. What? The man tapped the envelope. You don't have to believe me, but someone will. His name was Thomas Bell, a former junior custodian assigned to the government research facility built beneath the old Henderson estate in 1857. He was 17 when he began, 76 when he finally told his story. Inside the envelope were sketches, notes, torn journal entries, and one thing no one in the modern world had ever seen: a copy of Abigail Henderson's diary. Bell's story was archived in classified vaults until 1971, when a retired analyst uncovered it by accident. Here is what Bell wrote, his final statement word for word. I never meant to get involved. I was just a janitor. I cleaned floors, emptied ashtrays. I wasn't supposed to see anything, but I did. I saw the twins in the chamber. I mopped the floor outside their containment room. Sometimes I could hear them talking, not out loud, not with mouths, but they were in my head. I saw them age backward. I saw them disappear and reappear in different corners of the room. I watched a doctor collapse after staring into their eyes too long, blood pouring from his nose like a faucet. They never moved when we watched. But one time I left my mop too close to the glass. When I returned 5 minutes later, it was clean, standing upright, as if someone used it. We were told not to speak their names, but they knew ours. They would press their palms against the glass and whisper nothing, but we'd feel it, like a cold wind behind the eyeballs. I saw men go mad. One shot himself after scribbling a spiral into every page of his notebook, over and over again, until the pen ran dry and he started using his blood. Bell wrote that, in 1860, after the whisper incident, the twins were supposedly sedated and sealed beneath the lab. But Bell swore the twins were never put to sleep. They simply stopped appearing. The chamber remained cold, empty, silent, but strange things continued. The spiral glowed faintly every night at 3:33 a.m., Bell wrote. No power in the room, just light from underneath, like something was breathing just below the floor. I could still hear them sometimes, calling names, not mine, other people, names I would later hear on the news, dead, missing, gone. Bell quit the lab in 1861, shortly after a night when he claimed to have seen Abigail. She stood at the end of the corridor, barefoot, wearing a white dress soaked at the hem. Her hair was long, face blank, eyes all pupil. She said only one thing: they're not locked in. They're letting you believe that. And then she vanished. No one believed him. He fled the state, changed his name, became a carpenter. But the dreams never stopped. He dreamed of Black Hollow, of two identical figures holding hands at the edge of the trees, of whispers in the dark that sounded like prayers spoken backward, of a spiral slowly turning beneath the earth. He kept the diary, Abigail's words. He swore it changed over time. New pages appearing, blank pages filled with writing in her hand, even though she'd been missing for over 70 years. One final entry appeared the night before Belle died. It simply read, "The circle was never meant to close. Asterisk, they are not two. They are one mind, one will, split to observe your world through symmetry. And the symmetry is breaking." The diary disappeared from the archive vaults in 1973. No one knows where it is, but photocopies survive. And Belle's last note, scrawled shakily in the margin of his confession, remains untouched. They were not studied by science. They allowed it. They were not born. They were invited. Present day, local legends still circulate in Ellison. Children dare each other to spend the night near where Henderson House once stood. Some say if you listen closely in the woods at night, you can still hear two young voices humming in unison. A lullaby no mother ever taught. Others speak of twin shadows seen in mirrors, just for a split second, always behind your shoulder. And some whisper of a return, that the spiral beneath the earth is beginning to turn again, that the symmetry is realigning, and that Elias and Elijah Henderson never truly left